You ever get news so cold it doesn't even register as pain? Just static. Background noise in a moment your body already decided it can't feel anymore. That was me. Tuesday morning, 7:04 a.m. The lilies for the service hadn't arrived yet. The funeral home had texted twice, and my hand was shaking over the coffee pot when the email came through. Urgent HR meeting, 8 a.m., in person required. No subject line, no condolences, just a calendar invite. From the same company I'd given 18 years of my life to. The same place that sent me sympathy fruit last month. When my husband's chemo stopped working, I stared at the screen, still wearing his old flannel shirt. The one that smelled like cinnamon and cedar and every soft thing I'd lost. And I knew. Not in a dramatic way, not some cinematic gut punch. No, this was quieter, colder. They were going to let me go, and they didn't even wait for the dirt to settle. I could have ignored the meeting, could have called in, but something about it, something sharp and unfinished, made me grab my coat instead. I left the house without makeup, still wearing funeral black, still wondering if grief had a bottom, because I hadn't found it yet, and by the time I stepped into that office, the same one where I trained half the finance team, I already knew this wasn't just a meeting. It was an execution, and they were about to make one final cut. They say loyalty still means something, but I've learned, in corporate America, it's just another word for leverage. 18 years. That's how long I showed up. Early, not just on time. That's how long I reviewed financials nobody else wanted to touch. How long I stayed late when the building was empty, but the spreadsheets weren't. I didn't ask for praise. Didn't need a plaque or some half-hearted birthday balloon. All I ever asked for was to matter when it counted. I started when we were still doing audits by hand, back when the office smelled like toner and vending machine coffee. Back when people still looked you in the eye when they said thank you. And I grew with it, moved from analyst to auditor to compliance lead. Not because I played politics, but because I did the one thing nobody else had the stomach for. I told the truth, even when it made people uncomfortable. Even when the numbers pointed to corners, management didn't want lit. I swallowed things I shouldn't have had to swallow, like watching fresh Ivy League hires get fast-tracked over me, like having to sit quiet while a VP presented a plan I built from scratch. But I stayed, because the company had been good to me once, because I thought staying meant something. I used to believe that if you gave enough of yourself, someone would remember. Turns out, they did remember. Just long enough to calculate the exact day they could cut me loose without owing me a dime more than they had to. The room was too bright, fluorescent overheads buzzing like flies in a jar. HR had moved offices since I'd last been up there. But the smell was the same. Bleach, printer toner, and fake politeness. There were two people waiting. Not my manager, not even someone I knew. Just a rep with a clipboard, and a second face I didn't recognize. Someone from legal, they said, like that made it okay. They slid a packet across the table, not thick enough to be detailed, but heavy enough to carry weight. A separation agreement, 3 pages of soft threats disguised as policy. The offer, $5,000, if I signed. If I agreed never to speak about internal processes. If I waived my rights to challenge anything. Ever. If I didn't sign, no severance, no accrued RSUS, no medical carryover, no access to the pension I'd nearly qualified for. They said it all with smiles. They used words like transition and timing and economic necessity. Like any of that could make it less cruel. I looked at the paper, looked at the fake ferns in the corner, looked at the second hand on the wall clock. Tick, tick, ticking away like none of this was real. And then I did something they didn't expect. I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't beg. I just picked up the paper, folded it once, slid it into my purse, and stood. No signature. No thank you. No closure. They called after me, said I needed to return the badge. So I dropped it on the table as I walked out. It landed face down, just like they wanted me. By the time I got to the chapel, the lilies still hadn't arrived. Someone had laid out white carnations instead. Cheap, fragrant in the wrong kind of way. People were already seated, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, neighbors in too much black, and the pastor fumbling through a stack of index cards he'd clearly just written that morning. I sat in the second row, alone. No one asked where I'd been. No one noticed my hands shaking, or the crease in my purse where a 3-page betrayal still lived. They spoke about love, about legacy, about how grief is supposed to move through 5 stages. I counted none of them. Not denial, not anger, not bargaining. What I felt was something colder, cleaner, like standing in a house that's just been emptied. No furniture, no voices, just the echo of what used to be, and the faint sound of a lock clicking behind you. That morning, I buried a man I loved and watched a life I built get lowered into silence. But what no one knew, not then, not yet, was that something else had been planted in that silence too, and it wasn't done growing. After the funeral, the house felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that hums in your ears like something's missing, like the room's holding its breath. I went into the office. Not mine. His. Still smelled like aftershave and lemon oil. Still had the yellow sticky notes he used to write half-sentences on. He never finished his thoughts. Said he liked things open-ended. The drawer in the back. The one he once locked because he thought it made him look important. Hadn't been touched in months. Inside, an old laptop charger, 3 pens that didn't work, and a small black hard drive tucked behind a box of tax returns. I had forgotten it was there. Almost. It wasn't his. Wasn't personal. It was something I copied 2 years ago, when the company reorganized our data access and quietly asked us to delete everything over 5 years old. They said it was about storage limits. I knew better. I didn't keep it out of malice. I kept it out of instinct. Something didn't sit right back then, and even though I'd buried the doubt, it never really stopped breathing. So I plugged it in. The screen flickered, and suddenly, I wasn't a grieving widow anymore. I was back in the system, staring at things I wasn't supposed to remember, let alone still have. Things with names, dates, numbers that didn't line up, and all at once, the quiet in that room didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt like potential. It started with a file called Q4 Adjustments, Legacy Properties. Sounded harmless, something you'd send in a 4 p.m. email with a smiley face and a thanks for circling back. But I remembered that file. Not the numbers, but the feeling. Like brushing past a door that's supposed to stay locked. I opened it, saw rows of properties, addresses I recognized. Old warehouses in Tampa, an empty strip mall near Clearwater, a so-called corporate retreat in Georgia that was nothing more than a field and a rusty gate. all of them listed under internal leasing subsidiaries, all leased back to the parent company at above market rates, which meant deductions, which meant inflated costs, which meant the IRS saw expense where there was really just smoke and mirrors. At the time, they called it asset shielding, said it was industry standard, said I didn't need to worry about it. But the drive didn't just have one file. It had the emails, the revisions, the legal memos that started with, "If this ever gets audited," and ended with, "Destroy after reading." And the worst part? I'd seen it all before. I'd flagged it. I'd sent the report, and I was told very directly to put it to rest. So I did. I buried it in my head, like they buried my job. But now I had the shovel, and I wasn't digging up revenge. I was digging up receipts. There was a meeting 2 years ago I'll never forget. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Small conference room, frosted glass walls, coffee that tasted like burnt paper. A senior VP slid a report across the table. My report, the one I'd spent 6 weekends compiling. Page after page of lease discrepancies, suspicious cross-ownerships, and tax filings that didn't add up unless you tilted your head and held your breath. He didn't look mad, didn't raise his voice. He just leaned back in his chair, smiled, and said, "We call this smart accounting, not a problem." I asked, "Even the shell companies?" He said, "Especially the shell companies." Then he looked at me the way men in polished shoes often do, like I should be grateful to be in the room. Told me that if I wanted a future here, I'd learn to stop chasing shadows and start learning the difference between illegal and clever. That day, I walked out with a pit in my stomach. Not fear, disgust, but I didn't fight, didn't push back. Because my husband had just started chemo, because our insurance was tied to my badge, because sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's survival. I kept my mouth shut, buried the file, and did what I had to do. But now that I was no longer on payroll, no longer playing nice, that file had a second life, and it was about to start speaking for itself. There's a drawer in my kitchen I used to call the graveyard. Old coupons, dead batteries, tangled cords. 3 pairs of reading glasses I kept losing, then finding again. And somewhere near the back, underneath a pack of sticky notes and a dried-out pen, was a card I hadn't touched in over a decade. Off-white, worn edges, text slightly smudged from years of rubbing against receipts and broken rubber bands. Michael Sandler, IRS, Regional Compliance Division, Direct Line. I met him back when I was a junior auditor. Before promotions, before politics, before I knew how often justice came second to quarterly profits. He once told me, "If something ever smells wrong, don't wait until it's burning to speak up." I hadn't spoken to him since 2012. Didn't even know if the number still worked, but I dialed anyway, phone to my ear. Heartbeat louder than dial tone. 3 rings. Mike Sandler. He still answered like that. Flat, blunt, no fluff. I didn't say my name right away. Just told him where I used to work. Told him I still had something I was never supposed to keep. His voice didn't change. He just asked one question. "Is it time sensitive?" I said, "It's been burning for years." There was a pause. I could hear papers being shuffled. Then he said 3 words. "Send it over." No lecture, no drama, just a quiet green light. I didn't ask what would happen next. Didn't need a roadmap. Because the truth? I didn't want to watch the fire this time. I just wanted to hand someone the match. and walk away. The thing about staying quiet is people start thinking you've accepted defeat, that you've packed up your pride and shelved it next to the thank you mugs and farewell cupcakes. They see silence as surrender. They confuse stillness with absence. I didn't post a thing. No cryptic Facebook statuses, no LinkedIn career update, no GoFundMe for lost pensions or broken promises. I went dark, and to them, that meant I'd moved on, disappeared. Truth is, I was watching press releases, watching SEC filings, watching the quarterly reports dance around a dip in revenue they couldn't quite explain. They blamed inflation, blamed vacancies, blamed changing market conditions. But I knew what was coming. Because I wasn't chasing justice with a spotlight. I was building it in the dark. There's a certain satisfaction in not being the voice at the microphone, but the ghost in the machine. They'd fired me to cut a cost. Thought I'd go quietly. Thought grief would knock me flat, and their little NDA trick would bury the rest. But they forgot something. I'd spent 18 years auditing systems, reading fine print, finding what wasn't meant to be found. And silence? Silence wasn't my retreat. It was the warning they didn't hear coming. It started with a headline, buried beneath political drama and celebrity breakups. But I saw it. IRS launches multi-state probe into commercial real estate tax schemes. No names, no companies mentioned. Just buzzwords, shell entities, inflated leasebacks, undeclared assets. The kind of language that never makes it to morning TV, but sends executive boardrooms into full-blown panic. I refreshed the article 3 times. Same wording, same sources. Anonymous tips. Confidential whistleblower file received 6 weeks ago. I didn't smile, didn't pump a fist, just closed the laptop slowly and let my breath out for the first time in days. See, I knew how these things worked. Nothing public at first, just quiet visits, requests for documentation, subpoenas that don't ring headlines until someone starts sweating. The chain reaction would start small. An assistant controller getting called into HR. A compliance officer suddenly on leave. Board members holding meetings that mysteriously didn't require minutes. And eventually, someone would realize they couldn't contain it. They'd start to wonder how deep the rot went, how long it had been festering under polished floors and quarterly earnings calls. They'd look around the room and start counting who knew what, who said nothing, and, worst of all, who kept records. They still didn't know who lit the match. But federal eyes? They were open now, and what they were staring at wasn't just a company. It was a cover-up, finally out in daylight. 3 months later, the stock dipped. Not a nosedive, just a slow, sick slide. At first, they blamed market uncertainty. Then cyclical downturns. Then, my favorite, temporary restructuring efforts. But the truth was leaking through cracks they couldn't patch fast enough. Vendors stopped renewing contracts. One of their lenders quietly pulled out. And an internal email, marked confidential, somehow ended up on a public finance blog. It said, "We may need to reassess exposure if the inquiry widens." I knew what that meant. It meant they weren't just under audit. They were circling the drain. And then it happened. A vice president resigned without warning. Another was placed on administrative leave. And someone who used to walk into meetings like he owned the oxygen, was indicted for obstruction. Turns out shredding old files isn't as permanent as people think. Turns out digital backups don't burn. And when the feds want to connect dots, They don't care if you were C-suite or just CC'd. I read every article, every vague press release, every dry, sanitized memo from the board, and with every word, one thought kept echoing. They lost more than they saved. They tried to cheat the system, tried to cheat me, tried to bury me quietly 3 weeks before my pension vested. But the cost of cutting corners? It doesn't show up on spreadsheets. It shows up when trust collapses, when investors flinch, when regulators pull receipts from places no one was supposed to look. They thought firing me was a business decision, a clean cut, another number in the annual report. But the truth? They didn't fire a number. They fired a witness. And that comes with interest. The story ran for 4 days. Local outlets, then regional. By the 5th day, it had already dropped below a celebrity divorce and a freak snowstorm in Texas. By day 7, it was gone, replaced by whatever came next. Because that's how the world moves. Fast, forgetful, and never where justice actually finishes. But inside that company, it didn't fade. Not for the interns suddenly told their roles were no longer budgeted. Not for the assistants quietly walked out by security. Not for doing wrong, but for knowing too much. One of the receptionists sent me a message. Anonymous, from a throwaway email with no name. It just said, "You were right. It's all unraveling." And I should have felt something. Relief. Vindication. Maybe even satisfaction. But I didn't, because I'd been inside those walls. I knew the names behind the departments, knew which cubicles held people just trying to keep a roof over their heads, just like I had. The damage wasn't just corporate. It was personal. Real people. Real paychecks. Real homes. They got caught in a fire they never lit. And I had to ask myself, quietly, late at night, if I had started something that scorched more than it saved. But every time that guilt crept in, I remembered the meeting, the smirks, the way they dangled my husband's insurance over my silence, the cold math they used to erase me from their books like I was just overhead. This wasn't revenge. It was a correction, a long overdue shift in balance. And sure, the headlines faded, the cameras moved on, the world forgot. But inside those glass towers with their manicured lobbies and Employee of the Month plaques still hanging crooked, consequences were echoing, louder than any headline ever could. People like to say things like, "Time heals," or "You'll bounce back," or my personal favorite, "You're stronger than you think." They mean well. But most of them don't know what it's like to stand in the ashes of the life you built and pretend it's just dust on your shoes. After everything, I didn't buy a new house. Didn't move to some fresh city with sunlight and second chances. I downsized. 1-bedroom apartment off a quiet road, the kind of place with thin walls and louder neighbors, where the fridge hums all night and the heat takes its time. I sold the dining set, gave away the china. There were no more holidays to host anyway. Grief doesn't leave, it just gets quieter. Sometimes I'd catch myself reaching across the bed in the dark, thinking I'd find him there. But there was only cold air and the soft sound of my own breath, too loud in a room meant for two. I wasn't bitter, not exactly, but I wasn't healed either. I was something else, something in between. A woman who'd survived the fire, but still smelled the smoke every morning. And maybe that's the part no one says out loud. That moving on isn't a clean break. It's waking up in the same body with a different weight on your shoulders and learning how to walk with it. It started with a comment, just a quiet reply under someone's post about workplace layoffs. I didn't mention names, didn't share details. I just wrote, sometimes being let go has less to do with performance and more to do with timing, age, and silence. I thought it would disappear, like most things do online. But within a week, I had 10 emails sitting in a dusty inbox I barely checked anymore. Different cities, different industries, different stories, but the same ache, the same pattern. Women in their 40s and 50s, cut off without warning, right before stock options vested, right after disclosing a pregnancy, right when they thought they'd finally earned safety. One was a school administrator, let go for budget concerns after 22 years. Another worked at a logistics firm, replaced by a man with half her experience and double her swagger. They didn't want pity. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to ask if they were crazy for thinking maybe, just maybe, it hadn't been an accident. And so I started answering. One by one, I told them what to look for in their severance clauses, told them to keep their emails, told them where to find employment attorneys who didn't flinch at NDAs, told them the one thing no company handbook ever says: you are not disposable just because they decided you were expensive. And with every reply, I felt something shift. For the first time in months, the weight I'd been carrying didn't feel so solitary. It felt shared, distributed, like maybe the worst thing that happened to me wasn't just an ending. Maybe it was a door. And maybe on the other side of that door, there were more women who were done being polite about being erased. The office space wasn't much, just a corner unit above a dry cleaner with humming fluorescent lights and one window that looked out over a parking lot full of potholes. But it was mine. Second-hand desk, used printer from Craigslist, one rolling chair that squeaked every time I leaned back too far. There was no logo on the door, no plaque, no receptionist, just a white piece of paper taped to the glass. Strategic exit, quiet justice for working women. I didn't plan to start anything, not really. But the emails kept coming, and somewhere between draft 3 of a sample demand letter and a 2-hour phone call with a woman in Ohio who'd just been let go after 30 years, I realized this wasn't just empathy anymore, it was action. So I printed templates, created guides, started helping people break down contracts written by lawyers who thought no one would ever read the fine print. No courtroom battles, no public campaigns, just strategy, whispered plans, quietly executed. Because sometimes the loudest revenge is making sure the next woman isn't blindsided. I never asked for payment. Sometimes they brought coffee. Once, someone left a potted plant on my doorstep with a note that said, "You didn't save my job, but you saved my dignity." And maybe that's what it had become. Not a war, not a reckoning, but a return to something that had been taken from all of us, bit by bit, form by form, signature by forced signature. I didn't rebuild my old life. That one was gone. But in its place, I'd built something quieter, more powerful, a place where silence wasn't expected. It was used like a scalpel, careful, precise, and undeniable. The question came up more than once, usually from friends, sometimes from strangers, always from people who meant well. Why didn't you sue them? You had evidence. You could have taken them down. And I get it. From the outside, it makes sense. Big company wrongs loyal employee. Loyal employee gets revenge, walks out with a court settlement and a victory speech. But real life? It's messier, slower, colder. Litigation takes years. It drains your savings, your energy, your sleep, and in the end, they don't apologize. They just cut a check and file it under cost of doing business. I didn't want a courtroom. I didn't want headlines. I didn't want to sit in front of people in suits and explain again why my dignity mattered more than their quarterly projections. I wanted peace, not a payout. And more than that, I wanted to take what they built in silence and flip it, make silence work against them, turn their own secrecy into spotlight. Not loud, not viral, just strategic. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't dragging them into the light. It's making sure they never know exactly how much you've already taken back.